Welcome to the session on dose response in environmental health. My name is Dr. Voi, working in the Environmental and Occupational Health Division. I will be introducing you to the concept of dose response in toxicology. Watch this 10-minute video lecture on dose response relationships. As you watch this lecture, please consider these following questions. What happens if the dose is increased? What is the dose response curve? What is the shape of the curves? And lastly, what is the threshold effect? The field of environmental health has a broad focus and includes a number of subspecializations. For example, occupational health. In week 3 of this module, you looked at the workplace on Dollar Street and we discussed the effect of work on people. As a result, it is not a surprise that workplaces are another form of environment and as such affect our health. The field of environmental health draws heavily upon epidemiology, which is a topic for next week, and toxicology, which is considered by others as the study of poisons. Toxicology is a science applied in determining how certain chemicals can harm us under particular conditions. Once we understand how the environment harms us, we can seek ways to prevent and alleviate the harm. Environmental epidemiologists use this knowledge from toxicology to study populations exposed to environmental agents when looking for possible connections between exposures and adverse health outcomes. First, we need to make a distinction between exposure and dose. Both are important in the final assessment of the response of organisms to toxic substances. In simple terms, exposure is outside the body, whereas dose is inside the body. A response from the exposure is the observed change in structure or function, resulting in morbidity or, in extreme cases, mortality. In other words, response defines and characterizes the endpoint following exposure over a period of time. The dose-response relationship is a fundamental and essential concept in toxicology. It correlates exposures and induced effects. With this relationship, a toxicologist attempts to place quantitative measurements on the magnitude of the hazard in question. By developing a dose-response curve to characterize the relationship between the dose of the agent and the incidence of the health effect. The dose-response relationship is based on observed data from experimental animals or human clinical studies or cell studies. Generally, the higher the dose, the more severe the response. This response is dependent on both the exposure and time, which can vary greatly. For example, using equal dose but applied differently over time, the observed response can vary. Let us illustrate this concept. A high concentration of alcohol taken over a very short time may be lethal, while prolonged intake of smaller amounts does little harm in the short term. However, the damage to organs is observed later in life. There are many examples on dose relationship that you can find on the web. Some of these are shown in the presented table. The dose-response relationship is based on 3 assumptions. The first assumption is that the response is due to chemical studied, or the substance that is showing the cause-effect relationship as shown in the table. The second assumption is that there is a molecular target site. Therefore, the observed magnitude of response shown in table is related to dose at the target site in the body. The third assumption is that in order to observe the changes, there exists a quantifiable method of measuring the precise expression of toxicity. The first thing to do in dose response assessment is to establish that the chemical or exposure being studied has in fact induced the observed effects response. See curve A. Graphic presentation of dose-response relationship helps visualize the relationship between increases in dose and resultant response. The x-axis represents the dose, typically in a logarithmic scale, to allow for plotting a wide range of doses in a single graph. The y-axis represents the response. Ordinarily, dose-response curves take the shape of the letter S as shown in curves B and C. In curve B, you can observe that in small doses there is no observed toxic response until the dose reaches 10 mg. This point is a threshold dose level, the point at which toxicity first appears. Some minimum dose level needs to be exceeded before the response occurs. A threshold for toxic effects occurs at the point where the body's ability to detoxify a toxin or its ability to repair toxic injury has been exceeded. The different toxins reach threshold dose levels at different doses, as shown in curve C. In this example, chemical A has a higher threshold than chemical B, which can be interpreted as that it requires a larger dose for chemical A to show injury or toxicity than is the case with chemical B. Another characteristic of the dose response curve that helps in understanding toxicity of a chemical is the slope. The slope for the dose response determines the rate at which injury builds up. The steeper the slope, the more potent is the chemical or toxin compared to other toxins. Consider what you can observe from the dose response curve C. In the slope equation A over B, it takes much more of B, that is more dose, for curve B to produce response A. This is the opposite for curve A. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this session on dose response.